Billionaire CEO's world shattered, abandoned twin sons from his ex-wife revealed on his 40th birthday party. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers when I saw her across the ballroom, standing there in a simple navy dress like an apparition from my past. Security was already moving toward her, but I raised my hand to stop them. "Imani, what are you doing here?" I whispered, pulling her toward a quiet corner away from the curious stares of board members and investors. 15 years, Elias, and you couldn't answer a single call or letter," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I've been trying to reach you for 12 years. I don't understand. What could possibly be so important after all this time?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, pressing it into my trembling hand. Two boys, maybe 12 years old, with my jawline, my eyes, my mother's smile. "Julian and Gabriel," she said softly. "Your sons. The twins have your cardiac condition, Elias. They need to know their father. And you need to know what you've missed. The world I'd built, the billion-dollar empire, the acquisitions, the careful isolation of success collapsed under the weight of two names I'd never heard before. My sons. How could I have children I never knew existed? Have you ever had your entire life shattered in a single moment? That instant when everything you thought was real suddenly reveals itself as incomplete? If you've ever experienced that earth-shifting revelation that changes everything, hit that like button right now. Welcome to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories, where we dive into the moments that transform lives forever. I'm sharing this story because it reminds us that success without connection is the hollowest of victories. And sometimes, what we think we've lost was never really ours to begin with. Tonight's story will take you from the glittering heights of corporate power to the humble garage where two brilliant boys built a technological marvel with salvaged parts. You'll witness a father discovering children he never knew existed and a mother who protected them fiercely while never erasing their heritage. By the end, you'll understand why sometimes the most valuable things we can possess aren't listed in any portfolio. The Ocean View Hotel in Newport sparkled with calculated opulence that evening. Crystal chandeliers cast diamond-like reflections across the polished marble floors. The air hummed with a particular energy that only assembles when the combined net worth in a room exceeds the GDP of small nations. This was the domain Elias Winters had crafted for himself, a world of power dressed in tailored suits, where sentences that began with please could end with billion. Elias stood at the center of it all, a man who had seemingly mastered the art of presence without participation. At exactly 40 years old as of that evening, he had the sharp features of someone who had spent decades making decisions that altered markets. His dark hair showed the first distinguished touches of silver at the temples. His custom tuxedo concealed the physique maintained by precisely scheduled workouts with trainers who knew better than to engage in small talk. But it was his eyes that truly revealed him, calculating, restless, and profoundly alone. Vanessa Chen, his chief of staff, appeared at his side with the practiced timing of someone who had managed his life for 8 years. Her sleek black dress and severe bun projected exactly the right combination of efficiency and inaccessibility. "The Goldmans just arrived," she murmured. "And the Davies team is by the East Bar. Mitchell has been watching for an opportunity to corner you about the AI division valuation." "I'll speak with Davies after the toast," Elias replied, adjusting the platinum cufflinks engraved with his initials, a gift from his late father and one of the few possessions he'd kept from his life before success. "No concessions on their neural interface patents. The whole division needs restructuring before it's worth what they're asking." Vanessa nodded, making a note on her tablet. "And your speech?" "Memorized. Your mother's foundation donation announcement." "Prepared. The champagne for the toast is the 82 Cristal, as requested." She hesitated, then added, "Are you all right, Elias? You seem distracted." He almost smiled at that. Distracted was Vanessa's diplomatic term for the state she'd observed in him with increasing frequency over the past year. A restlessness that no acquisition target or market expansion could seem to satisfy. "Just tired," he said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "I've been tired for 40 years. She nodded, professional enough not to press further. The toast is scheduled for 8:30. I'll begin gathering everyone at 8:20. As she disappeared back into the crowd, Elias let his gaze drift across the ballroom. 200 of the most influential people in technology and finance had gathered to celebrate his birthday, or more accurately, to be seen celebrating his birthday, to secure their connection to Winter's innovation and its visionary founder. He recognized every face, could catalog their strategic value, their vulnerabilities, their potential usefulness. And he felt nothing at all. This emptiness wasn't new. It had been his constant companion for years, growing more insistent as his empire expanded. The rational part of his mind recognized it as the inevitable cost of achievement, the isolation necessary to maintain focus, to make the hard decisions that had transformed Winter's innovation from a struggling startup into the technology empire that now controlled a third of the global communications market. The irrational part, the part he worked diligently to silence, wondered if he had miscalculated somewhere along the way. If in optimizing for success, he had eliminated something essential. At precisely that moment of weakness, he saw her. Despite 15 years in a room full of powerful people in evening wear, Imani Rhodes was impossible to miss. She stood near the entrance, speaking quietly to one of the security staff who kept glancing nervously in Elias's direction. Her hair was arranged in the same intricate braids she'd worn in graduate school, though now with strands of silver catching the light. The simple navy dress she wore was a deliberate counterpoint to the designer gowns surrounding her. For a moment, he was 25 again, watching Imani sketch architectural designs in the small apartment they'd shared during his graduate studies. Before the venture capital, before the patents, before he'd chosen his company over everything else. Vanessa materialized beside him again, following his gaze to the entrance. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said automatically, then corrected himself. "Yes. Excuse me." He moved through the crowd, accepting birthday wishes with distracted nods. When he reached Imani, she was already watching him, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, steering her toward a less crowded corner of the ballroom. "I wouldn't be if you returned phone calls," Imani replied, her voice carrying the same quiet strength he remembered. "Or emails. Or responded to certified letters." "What are you talking about? I haven't heard from you since you walked away to build your empire." She finished. "I know. But I've been trying to reach you for 3 months. Why now? After 15 years? Imani looked at him with something like pity. "Because they deserve to know their father, and you deserve to know your sons." The word struck him like physical blow. "Sons?" She opened her purse and removed a folded paper, handing it to him. "Julian and Gabriel. They're 12. Twins." Her voice softened slightly. "They have your mind, Elias. Your way of seeing patterns in everything." He unfolded the paper, a photograph of 2 boys with copper-brown skin slightly lighter than Imani's, serious eyes, and the distinctive cleft chin that had been passed down through 3 generations of Winter's men. "This is impossible," he said, though the evidence stared back at him with undeniable clarity. "We were careful." "And you never." "I tried to tell you," she interrupted. "When I found out, you were in Tokyo launching your first major product. My calls went to assistants who promised you'd call back. You never did." Elias's mind raced through calculations. 12 years. That would have been right after their breakup, after he'd secured his first serious investment and everything had accelerated. The months were a blur of 18-hour workdays and international flights. Why wait all this time? He demanded. 12 years, Imani. I didn't wait. I tried for months, then years. I sent letters to your office. I tried to arrange meetings through your staff. Every attempt was blocked. She met his eyes directly. Eventually, I stopped trying to force my way through the walls you built. That's not. He began, then stopped. He had built those walls deliberately, instructing his team to filter distractions, prioritize strategic relationships. Had her attempts been classified as distractions? Would his staff have even told him? Why now? He asked again, his voice lower. Julian was diagnosed with the same cardiac condition your father had, Imani said quietly. The doctors need your medical history. And the boys, they're asking questions I can't answer anymore. Elias looked back at the photograph. His sons. His children. A medical condition they might have inherited from him. Where are they now? At home with my sister. They don't know I'm here. She took back the photo, her fingers brushing his. I'm not asking for money, Elias. We've managed fine. But they deserve to know where they come from. Who they come from. Before he could respond, Vanessa appeared beside them. Mr. Winters, the Davy sons are asking for you. She glanced at Imani with professional neutrality. Should I tell them you'll be a few minutes? The question hung between business and personal, between the life he'd built and the one he'd never known existed. Cancel my meetings tomorrow, he told Vanessa without looking away from Imani. All of them. But the Davies negotiation can wait, he finished. Family emergency. The word family felt strange on his tongue. New and ancient simultaneously. If you've ever had your priorities suddenly, dramatically rearranged in a single moment, comment priorities shift below. Share this with someone who needs a reminder about what truly matters in life. The drive to Imani's home passed in a surreal blur. Elias sat in the passenger seat of her modest sedan, the photograph of his sons clutched in his hand, while outside the window, Newport transformed from the manicured oceanfront properties of the ultra-wealthy to the more modest neighborhoods inland. Newport wasn't supposed to be part of his present. The coastal town with its colonial architecture and salt-worn docks belonged to his past, specifically to the years before Winter's innovation existed. Before he became the man whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like the digital visionary reshaping global communication. It was the board that had insisted on hosting his 40th birthday gala at the Ocean View Hotel, the same hotel where he proposed to Imani 15 years earlier. At the time, he hadn't had the energy to object. Let them assume it was sentiment that made him agree, rather than indifference. It was easier than explaining that Newport, like so many other things in his life, had become just another location, stripped of meaning by the relentless forward momentum of his ambition. Now, as Imani navigated the familiar streets, memories surfaced with unexpected clarity. The coffee shop where they'd spent countless hours studying during graduate school. The small park where he'd first told her about his vision for neural interface technology. The beach where they'd walked at sunrise after staying up all night arguing about whether technology should shape human behavior or merely respond to it. You're thinking about back then, Imani said, breaking the silence between them. I can still read your face, you know. I was remembering how sure I was, he admitted. About everything. She nodded, her eyes on the road. You were the most certain person I'd ever met. It was attractive until it wasn't. The technology one imagined then, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the skyline. It exists now. We're deploying neural interfaces in medical settings that are saving lives. I know. I followed your work. Your success. But not the personal cost, he thought but didn't say. The increasing emptiness as each achievement failed to provide the satisfaction he'd expected. The relationships that never lasted because, as his last girlfriend had explained while packing her things, there's no room for another person in a life already filled with Elias Winters and his vision. Why didn't you use the trust fund? He asked as they turned into a quiet neighborhood of modest homes. The money he'd set up when they parted ways, his attempt at a clean conscience. It felt too much like payment for leaving, Imani replied, turning into a driveway. Like you were purchasing your freedom from us. That wasn't it doesn't matter now. She unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to face him fully. What matters is how we handle this moment. They're smart boys, Elias. Perceptive. They'll see through any performance. He nodded, suddenly understanding her meaning. These children would recognize insincerity immediately. The same way he always had. I'm not here to perform, he said quietly. She studied him, then nodded once. Good. Wait here a moment. The house was nothing like Elias expected. Given his net worth and the settlements he'd paid in his rare relationships, he'd imagined Imani and his sons living in luxury. Instead, she had driven them to a modest two-story in a quiet neighborhood, wind chimes hanging from the porch, a basketball hoop installed over the garage. Imani entered the house alone, leaving Elias in the car with his thoughts and the photograph he'd asked to keep. Two serious-faced boys standing on what looked like a hiking trail, mountains behind them. One slightly taller, one with glasses. Both with his father's eyes. 5 minutes stretched like hours before Imani reappeared at the door, gesturing for him to come inside. The living room was warm, lined with bookshelves overflowing with science texts, novels, and what appeared to be architectural models. A collection of awards and certificates hung on one wall. Mathematics competitions, science fairs, piano recitals. The evidence of 12 years of growth and achievement he'd missed entirely. And then they were there, standing side by side at the entrance to the kitchen. Identical in the broad strokes, height, build, the shape of their faces, but distinct in the details. The one on the left had a small scar above his eyebrow. The one on the right wore wire-rimmed glasses and stood with his weight shifted slightly backward, as if preparing to retreat if necessary. Julian, Gabriel, Imani said gently. This is Elias Winters. Not your father. Just his name, leaving space for them to determine what he would become to them. Hello, Elias said, his voice rougher than intended. The boy with glasses, Gabriel, according to the careful notation on the back of the photograph, spoke first. You look like your TED Talk from 2023. The one about quantum computing applications. You watched that? Elias asked, surprised. Julian nodded. We've watched all your public presentations. And read the papers you published before founding Winters Innovation. Your work on parallel processing architecture was ahead of its time, Gabriel added, his voice quieter than his brother's but no less confident. Though your conclusions about neural interface applications were overly optimistic. A startled laugh escaped Elias. Not the reaction of starstruck children meeting a famous parent, but of young scientists evaluating a colleague's work. Pride swelled unexpectedly in his chest. Those conclusions have proven accurate, he found himself responding. The timeline was the only miscalculation. The processing speed constraints were underestimated, Julian countered. We ran simulations. You ran simulations? Of my neural interface projections? Imani smiled slightly. They built a testing environment in our garage last summer. Repurposed gaming equipment and some parts they ordered online. It's rudimentary, Gabriel said quickly. Limited by our access to proper hardware. Elias looked between the boys, his sons and their mother, trying to absorb the reality that while he'd been building a technology empire, they had been here, carrying his intellect, working with limited resources to explore the same questions that drove him. I'd like to see it, he said simply. Something shifted in the room, a subtle release of tension. Julian straightened slightly. Gabriel's weight shifted forward. It's kind of a mess right now, Julian warned. I don't mind messes, Elias replied, though anyone who knew him professionally would have called this a blatant lie. His office, his homes, his life, all were monuments to precise organization. Gabriel looked to Imani, who nodded permission. Go ahead. I'll make some coffee. The garage had been transformed into what Elias recognized immediately as a serious workspace. 3 salvaged monitors connected to custom-built processing units. Circuit boards in various states of assembly. Notebooks filled with equations and diagrams in handwriting that shifted between precise and hurried, as if racing to capture thoughts before they disappeared. This is your simulation environment? Elias asked, examining a particularly elegant hardware configuration. Julian nodded. We had to modify the architecture to compensate for processing limitations. The cooling system is improvised, Gabriel added, pointing to a rather creative arrangement of fans. But it maintains optimal temperature during extended operations. Elias crouched to examine their work more closely. What they'd accomplished with limited resources was remarkable, not just the technical execution but the conceptual understanding. These boys, at 12, grasped principles that most of his senior engineers struggled with. "This is exceptional," he said quietly. "It's functional," Julian corrected, though Elias caught the flash of pride in his eyes. For the next hour, they walked him through their project, explaining modifications, defending design choices, occasionally arguing between themselves about technical details. They moved with the synchronized rhythm of those who have worked together their entire lives, finishing each other's sentences, intuiting connections without explicit explanation. Elias found himself responding in kind, falling into the pure joy of technical discussion without corporate agendas or strategic considerations. Just ideas, challenges, solutions, the raw intellectual exchange he'd once lived for before boardrooms and investor relations consumed his days. When they finally returned to the house, Imani was waiting with coffee for Elias and hot chocolate for the boys. She watched them quietly, noting the animation in their faces, the way all three gestured with the same precise hand movements when explaining concepts. "Did you see their quantum entanglement model?" she asked Elias as the twins went to wash up. "Yes," he replied, still processing what he'd witnessed. They're extraordinary, Imani." "I know." A complex emotion crossed her face, pride tinged with something like sadness. "They've had questions I couldn't answer for years. Technical questions beyond my knowledge, yes, but also questions about you. Where their minds come from. Why they see patterns others miss." Elias set down his coffee. "I would have been here if I'd known." "Would you?" she asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. 15 years ago, you chose your vision over everything else. Over us. Would knowing about them have really changed that trajectory? The question hit him with unexpected force. Would he have chosen differently? The young man he'd been obsessed with changing the technological landscape, convinced his ideas could reshape humanity's future, would that version of himself have embraced fatherhood, adjusted his ambitions? "I don't know," he finally admitted. "But I'd like to think I would have tried." Imani nodded, accepting his honesty. "Well, you're here now. The question is what happens next. Have you ever discovered something about yourself through your children? Something that was always there but you couldn't see until you recognized it in them? Type DNA connection in the comments if you've experienced this powerful moment of recognition." The memory of that night in the hotel room in Tokyo returned with unexpected clarity as Elias sat in Imani's kitchen. He had been 38 hours without sleep, running on black coffee and the particular euphoria that came with breakthrough success. The neural interface prototype had performed flawlessly during the demonstration. Potential investors were practically throwing term sheets at him. His phone had been buzzing constantly with congratulatory messages, media requests, and the particular type of attention that follows sudden, visible success. He had noticed Imani's calls, 3 of them, but in the blur of activity, they had seemed less urgent than the opportunities unfolding in front of him. He would call her back when things settled down. When he had time to properly focus on whatever she needed to discuss. But things never settled down. The prototype led to the first major investment round. The investment led to expanded operations. Expanded operations led to hiring a dedicated staff to manage communications, to prioritize his time, to filter the increasing noise of his growing notoriety. Now, watching Julian and Gabriel argue good-naturedly about the optimal configuration for their cooling system, he wondered how many other critical messages had been deemed non-priority by the succession of gatekeepers he'd installed between himself and the world. How many connections had been sacrificed on the altar of efficiency? "It's getting late," Imani said, breaking into his thoughts. "Boys, it's a school night." "But Mom," Julian protested. "We're just getting to the distributed processing model." Gabriel, more perceptive to the undercurrents in the room, was already standing. "We can continue another time. If Mr. Winters is willing to come back." "Elias." Please call me Elias, he said quickly, the title feeling strangely formal coming from his own son. Julian studied him for a moment. Will you come back? The question contained layers of meaning that Elias suspected the boy was fully aware of. It wasn't just about continuing their technical discussion. Yes, he said simply. I'd like that very much. The twins exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation, then nodded in unison. Good night, then, Gabriel said, precise and polite. We have questions, Julian added. A lot of them. I expect you do, Elias replied. And I'll answer all of them. As honestly as I can. Another synchronized nod, and then they were heading upstairs, leaving Elias alone with Imani in the kitchen. They're incredible, he said when they were out of earshot. How have you managed all this? The same way most single parents do, she replied, gathering the empty mugs. One day at a time, with no other option but to keep going. Single parent. The word struck him with their stark reality. While he'd been building his empire, Imani had been raising their sons alone. The evidence of her success surrounded them not just in the boys' obvious intelligence, but in their confidence, their articulateness, their evident bond with each other and their mother. I need to know everything, he said suddenly. All the things I've missed. First words, first steps. Their interests, their fears. Everything. Imani looked at him for a long moment. That's 12 years of life, Elias. It doesn't fit into a single conversation. I know. I just... He paused, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd missed. I want to understand who they are. She sat down across from him, her expression softening slightly. Julian spoke first, at 9 months. Full sentences by 15 months. He's always been the more verbal one, quick to express his thoughts. Gabriel thinks more deeply before speaking, but when he does, it's usually the most insightful perspective in the room. Like his mother, Elias observed. A small smile touched her lips. Perhaps. They both walked early 11 months. Both reading by 3. Piano for Gabriel, who has perfect pitch, though he hides it because it makes him self-conscious. Julian prefers mathematics and physical sciences. Gabriel leans toward theoretical physics and philosophy. She continued, filling in the broad strokes of 12 years with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly which details matter most. The high fever Julian had at 4 that sent them to the emergency room. The time Gabriel disappeared in a museum only to be found in deep conversation with a quantum physicist. Their first serious science fair project at 8, which earned them suspicious looks from judges who couldn't believe children had built a functioning atmospheric water harvester. With each story, the weight of Elias's absence grew heavier. These weren't just milestones he'd missed, they were fundamental moments in the formation of 2 human beings who carried his DNA, his intellect, his legacy. When did they start asking about me? He asked during a pause in her recounting. Imani's expression grew more guarded. Early. Around 4. The typical questions at first: where's daddy, why don't I have a daddy like my friends? I told them you were a brilliant man who was changing the world with your ideas. That sometimes people have different paths, and yours took you away from us. Her voice remained neutral, carefully stripped of accusation, but Elias felt the impact of her words nonetheless. As they got older, she continued, the questions became more specific. Especially once they began to understand your work, to recognize their own minds in yours. Julian asked once if you knew about them, if you had chosen not to be with them. Gabriel wanted to know if they had disappointed you somehow. Elias closed his eyes, pain lancing through him at the thought of his sons believing they were unwanted. What did you tell them? The truth. That you didn't know about them, that I had tried to tell you but couldn't get through. That it wasn't about them at all. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze directly. And they believed you. They're scientific minds, Elias. They don't accept statements without evidence. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. So I showed them these. The folder contained copies of emails, letters, phone records, and a meticulously documented history of her attempts to contact him over the years. Calls to his office that never went past assistance. Emails that received automated responses. Letters returned unopened. I kept records because I knew someday they would need to understand it wasn't a simple story of abandonment, Imani explained. That sometimes systems fail, especially systems designed to isolate powerful people from the messiness of real life. The final piece of evidence was a newspaper clipping from 6 years ago, a society page photo of Elias at a charity gala with a striking blonde woman on his arm. Scrawled in childish handwriting across the margin were the words, "Maybe he just has a new family now." The pain in his chest intensified. Who was she? He asked, pointing to the woman in the photo. Valerie something. An investment banker, I think. One of many over the years, according to the gossip columns. He barely remembered her. 6 years ago would have been during the aggressive European expansion phase. The relationship had lasted maybe 3 months before dissolving under the weight of his unavailability. None of them lasted, he said quietly. None of them were family. I know, Imani replied. But the boys didn't. How could they? Elias stared at the documentation of his systematic isolation, the very systems he had designed to protect his focus, his vision. The walls he'd built had been more effective than he'd ever realized, blocking not just distractions but life itself. The medical records, he said suddenly, remembering what had finally broken through those walls. Tell me about Julian's condition. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, she explained. The same condition your father had. We discovered it during a routine sports physical 3 months ago. It's moderate, manageable with medication and monitoring, but his cardiologist needed your medical history to develop the best treatment plan. And that's when you tried again to reach me. She nodded. Through every channel I could think of. Your corporate office, your foundation, your alumni network. I even contacted that tech journalist who wrote your profile for Wired last year. And nothing got through. Until I decided to go around the system entirely, she said. To physically show up where I knew you would be. Elias thought about the momentous coincidence or perhaps not coincidence at all that had brought them to this point. If the board hadn't insisted on Newport for his birthday celebration. If Imani hadn't been desperate enough to try one last approach. If Julian's condition hadn't been discovered. I need to stay in Newport, he said abruptly. I need to be here, to get to know them, to be part of their medical decisions. Imani studied him carefully. Your whole life is in Boston. Your company, your responsibilities. I can work remotely, he replied, already mentally rearranging his schedule, prioritizing what absolutely required his physical presence and what could be delegated. For the first time in 15 years, the choice felt clear. The path forward obvious. These are my sons, Imani. Whatever else I've failed at, I won't fail at this. Not now that I know they exist. The skepticism in her expression was entirely justified, given their history. But there was something else there too, a cautious hope, perhaps. A willingness to believe that people, even people as stubbornly determined as Elias Winters, could change when given sufficient reason. We'll take it one day at a time, she said finally. They'll have questions. Hard ones. You'll need to be honest with them, even when the truth doesn't paint you in the best light. I understand. And Elias? This isn't about easing your conscience or fulfilling some belated sense of obligation. This is about them what they need, what's best for their development. If at any point your presence becomes more disruptive than beneficial, I'll follow your lead, he promised. You've raised them for 12 years without me. You know them better than anyone. She nodded, accepting this acknowledgement of her authority where the twins were concerned. Go back to your hotel. Get some sleep. Come for dinner tomorrow at 6, and we'll begin the process of introducing you properly to your sons. As Elias stood to leave, another question occurred to him. Why didn't you use my last name for them? Imani's expression became unreadable again. Because names should be earned, not given. Because they deserved their own identities, not borrowed significance. The implied rebuke stung, but he couldn't argue with her reasoning. His own name had opened doors throughout his life, first as the son of a respected physicist, later as the founder of Winter's Innovation. His accomplishments had been built on that foundation, that inherited credibility. I understand, he said again, and meant it. At the door, Imani stopped him with one final question. What will you tell your board? Your investors? The press will eventually discover this, Elias. There will be questions about why you never acknowledged your sons before. The protective corporate instinct rose immediately to control the narrative, to frame the story in the most advantageous light. We'll need a strategy for he stopped himself, recognizing the reflexive retreat to business thinking. No. The only strategy that matters is what's best for Julian and Gabriel. If that means a PR crisis for Winter's Innovation, so be it. Imani studied him, perhaps searching for the calculated angle, the hidden agenda. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her. Good night, Elias. Tomorrow at 6. He nodded, stepping out into the cool Newport night. As the door closed behind him, he stood for a moment on the porch, listening to the faint sound of the boys' voices drifting down from an upstairs window. Discussing something with the animated intensity he recognized from his own creative process. His sons. The thought still felt surreal, impossible. Yet the evidence was irrefutable, not just in the physical resemblance or the documented medical history, but in the way their minds worked. In the particular clarity with which they saw connections others missed. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since leaving Imani 15 years earlier, Elias felt something like true purpose stirring beneath the ambition that had driven him for so long. Not the abstract purpose of technological innovation or market domination, but something immediate and vital. The purpose of fatherhood, however belatedly it had found him. As he walked back to his car, he pulled out his phone and sent a brief message to Vanessa, "Clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks. Family situation requires my full attention. Handle the Davies negotiations without me. I trust your judgment." The response came almost immediately, "Is everything all right?" He paused, considering how to answer. Finally, he typed, "No. But I think it might be, eventually." Then he drove back to his hotel room to begin planning for what would undoubtedly be the most important project of his life. Getting to know the sons he never knew he had, and perhaps in the process, rediscovering the man he might have been. If you've ever had to completely reconsider what's truly important in your life, or had to rebuild a relationship that seemed beyond repair, hit that subscribe button now. This channel is dedicated to the heart stories that remind us it's never too late to change our priorities and find our way back to what truly matters. The next morning, Elias woke early, his mind already racing with plans. He had exactly 10 hours before dinner at Imani's, 10 hours to begin the monumental reorganization of his life that would be necessary to accommodate this new reality. He started with a video call to his executive team, who were clearly unsettled by both his appearance still in yesterday's dress shirt, stubble darkening his usually clean-shaven face, and his announcement. "I'll be working remotely from Newport for the foreseeable future," he informed the 6 faces on his screen. "A family situation requires my physical presence here." "Family situation?" repeated Marcus Chen, his CFO, with poorly disguised skepticism. Elias had never mentioned family obligations in the 8 years they'd worked together. "Yes." Elias met each of their gazes directly, even through the digital interface. "I've recently discovered I have 12-year-old twin sons living here in Newport. I'll be taking time to establish a relationship with them." The stunned silence that followed was almost comical. Vanessa recovered first, her professional composure reasserting itself quickly. "I'll begin arrangements for a suitable workspace in Newport," she said. "And prepare appropriate statements for the board and key investors." "Thank you, Vanessa." Elias turned to his CTO. "Rebecca, you'll need to take point on the Davies acquisition. Focus on the neural interface patents, but be prepared to walk away if they won't budge on valuation. The meeting continued, with Elias methodically delegating critical responsibilities and establishing new communication protocols. Throughout, he could feel the unasked questions hovering in the virtual air between them. How could their intensely private CEO have unknown children? Why had this never come up before? What did this mean for the company's future? "Let me address what you're all thinking," he said finally. "This situation was as much a surprise to me as it is to you. The boy's mother attempted to contact me when she discovered she was pregnant, but those attempts never reached me." He paused, acknowledging his role in that failure. "Due to the communication filtering systems I myself put in place. Systems designed to protect your focus during critical growth phases," Vanessa offered, a lifeline of justification he chose not to grasp. "Systems that failed in their fundamental purpose," he corrected. "Because they filtered out what was actually most important. It's a mistake I intend to correct moving forward." The implications of this statement that Elias Winters, known for his single-minded dedication to Winters innovation, was reprioritizing his life weren't lost on anyone in the meeting. "Will you be bringing the boys to Boston?" Rebecca asked carefully. "No. Their lives are established here in Newport. Their mother has raised them exceptionally well. I'll be adapting to their situation, not the other way around." After the call ended, Elias sat back in his hotel chair, aware that he had just fundamentally altered his professional identity in the eyes of his leadership team. For 15 years, he had been the embodiment of unwavering focus, the visionary who never allowed personal considerations to interfere with the mission of technological advancement. Now, with a single announcement, he had introduced a variable none of them had anticipated. Elias Winters, the father, placing family above business imperatives. His phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa, board chair requesting urgent call. "How would you like to proceed?" He considered his options. The board would have questions, concerns about his commitment, about potential public relations implications. They would want reassurances, contingency plans, details about how this would impact the company's operations and image. "Scheduled for 2 p.m., he replied. "And Vanessa, prepare them for significant changes to my operating model going forward." His next call was to Dr. Maxwell Gardner, the cardiologist who had treated his father's hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and who had continued as Elias's own physician due to his familial risk factors. "Elias," Gardner's familiar voice came through the speaker. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Your annual physical isn't for another 3 months. I need information about HCM inheritance patterns, Max. And the current treatment protocols for adolescents." A brief pause. "Is this theoretical, or is there something you need to tell me?" "I have 12-year-old twin sons," Elias said, the statement becoming marginally less surreal with each repetition. "One has been diagnosed with moderate HCM. The same variant my father had." "I see." Gardner's professional tone couldn't quite mask his surprise. "Well, the good news is that treatments have advanced significantly since your father's time. With proper medication, monitoring, and lifestyle management, most patients lead normal, active lives. What would you need to properly assess his condition?" "Full medical records, including echocardiograms, stress tests, any genetic screening that's been done. And I'd want to examine him personally." "Both boys, actually, since if they're identical twins they're fraternal," Elias interrupted. "But yes, both should be monitored." The conversation continued, with Gardner providing detailed information about current treatment approaches, genetic testing options, and the importance of early intervention. Elias took meticulous notes, organizing the information in the same methodical way he approached all complex problems. When the call ended, he immediately began researching the best pediatric cardiologists in the Newport area, determined that Julian would have access to the highest quality care available. It was a concrete task, something tangible he could do immediately for his son, even as the larger questions of how to build a meaningful relationship remained dauntingly abstract. At precisely 6 o'clock that evening, Elias stood on Imani's porch again, this time with a carefully selected gift for each boy, advanced processing units that would significantly upgrade their garage lab and a bottle of wine for Imani, the same Syrah blend she had preferred during their graduate school days. The door opened, and Julian stood there, his expression a mixture of curiosity and guarded excitement. "You came back," he said, as if confirming a hypothesis. "I said I would," Elias replied simply. Julian nodded, satisfied with this straightforward answer. "We're having pasta. Mom says you used to make it for her sometimes, back when you were together." The casual reference to their past relationship startled Elias. How much had Imani shared with the boys about their history? "She was always better at it than I was," he said, following Julian into the house. "But I tried." Gabriel was setting the table, moving with precise efficiency. He looked up as they entered, his expression more reserved than his brother's. "Hello, Mr. Winters." "Just Elias is fine," he reminded him gently. "Or, whatever you're comfortable with." The implication hung in the air. The word neither boy had used yet, Dad. Imani emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a soft blue sweater so different from the formal navy dress of the night before, yet somehow more familiar. More like the woman he had once known so well. "Right on time," she observed. "Some habits don't change." "Punctuality is efficiency," Elias replied with the hint of a smile, echoing a phrase he had often used during their years together. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Yes, well. Dinner will be ready in 5 minutes. Boys, why don't you show Elias what you've been working on today?" Julian immediately launched into an animated explanation of the modifications they'd made to their simulation environment, leading Elias to the dining table where a laptop displayed a complex modeling program. Gabriel contributed more measured comments, correcting his brother's occasional exaggerations, clarifying technical details. Watching them, Elias was struck again by how perfectly they complemented each other, Julian's enthusiastic leaps of intuition balanced by Gabriel's methodical precision. Together, they formed a complete cognitive system, filling in each other's blind spots without conscious effort. Dinner itself was surprisingly comfortable. The twins, having moved past their initial shock, peppered Elias with questions about his work, his thoughts on emerging technologies, his predictions for future developments. These were safe topics, professional rather than personal, allowing all of them to establish common ground before venturing into more emotionally complex territory. It was during dessert, a simple berry crumble that Imani remembered had been another of his favorites, that Julian finally asked the question that had clearly been waiting all evening. "Why did you never try to find us?" he asked, his directness reminiscent of Elias's own approach to difficult subjects. "Even after you became successful enough to hire people who could have located us." Gabriel tensed beside his brother, but his eyes showed the same intense curiosity. Elias set down his spoon, aware that his answer to this question would establish the foundation of trust or distrust upon which any relationship with his sons would be built. "Because I truly didn't know you existed," he said simply. "And that's not an excuse. It's a failure on my part. I created systems to filter communications, to prioritize what I thought mattered most. I instructed my staff to protect my focus at all costs." He met their eyes directly. "Your mother tried to tell me about you. Multiple times, through multiple channels. But those messages never reached me because of the walls I built." Julian frowned. "That's inefficient system design. Critical information should always have priority pathways." "Yes," Elias agreed. "It was a fundamental architectural flaw. I optimized for the wrong variables." Gabriel studied him carefully. "You're saying you made a mistake in your algorithm? The most significant one of my life." The boys exchanged one of their silent communications, some unspoken assessment passing between them. "If you had known about us," Julian pressed, "what would you have done?" Elias considered giving them the answer they might want to hear, that he would have immediately abandoned his ambitions, focused entirely on fatherhood. But the promise he'd made to Imani echoed in his mind. You'll need to be honest with them, even when the truth doesn't paint you in the best light. I don't know, he finally admitted. The person I was 15 years ago was singularly focused. Obsessed with his vision to the exclusion of almost everything else. He glanced briefly at Imani, acknowledging the cost of that obsession. I'd like to believe I would have found a way to be present in your lives while still pursuing my work. But I can't honestly say that with certainty. The stark honesty of this answer seemed to satisfy them more than any reassuring fiction would have. What about now? Gabriel asked quietly. Now that you know about us. Now everything changes, Elias said without hesitation. I'm staying in Newport. I've already begun arrangements to work remotely, to restructure my responsibilities at Winter's Innovation. He leaned forward slightly. I've missed 12 years. I can't get those back. But I can be here now, if you'll allow it. I can be part of your lives going forward. The twins looked to their mother, seeking her guidance, her permission. We'll take it step by step, Imani said carefully. No pressure, no expectations. Just getting to know each other. Julian nodded decisively. I think that's acceptable. He turned to Elias. We have that science competition next week. The quantum entanglement model. You could come, if you want. The casual invitation, offered with studied nonchalance that couldn't quite mask its importance, caught Elias off guard. I'd be honored, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Gabriel pushed his glasses up his nose, a gesture Elias was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervous consideration. And maybe you could look at our code for the neural pattern recognition system we're developing. It's still throwing errors when we increase the data load past certain thresholds. I'd be happy to, Elias agreed, recognizing the olive branch for what it was, an opportunity to contribute, to be useful in a domain they all understood. After dinner, as Elias prepared to leave, Imani walked him to the door while the boys cleared the table. That went better than expected, she said quietly. They're remarkable, Imani. The way their minds work, how they complement each other. He shook his head in wonder. You've done an incredible job raising them. She accepted the compliment with a slight nod. They're good judges of character, Elias. They'll be watching to see if your actions match your words. I understand. Do you? She studied him carefully. Because this isn't like developing a new product or acquiring a company. There are no quarterly targets, no measurable ROI. This is slow, often frustrating work that doesn't always show immediate results. I know it won't be easy, he acknowledged. But nothing worthwhile ever is. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You always did have an answer for everything. Not anymore, he admitted. I have far more questions than answers these days. As he drove back to his hotel, Elias felt a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't immediately identify. There was the expected sense of loss for the years he'd missed, the opportunities to shape his son's development that could never be recovered. But there was also something unexpected, a lightness, a sense of possibility that had been absent from his life for longer than he cared to acknowledge. His phone buzzed with a text from Imani. Julian just asked if you could join us for his cardiology appointment next week. If you're available. The simple message crystallized what he was feeling. It wasn't just possibility, he realized. It was hope. Hope that despite everything, the years of absence, the walls he'd built, the priorities he'd chosen, there might still be a place for him in his sons' lives. A chance to be the father he'd never expected to become. I'll be there, he replied. Whatever they need, whenever they need it. Just tell me when and where. The next month unfolded in a series of careful steps forward, occasional retreats, and surprising moments of connection. True to his word, Elias extended his stay in Newport indefinitely, renting a furnished house overlooking the water and converting one of the bedrooms into a home office. His morning routine, once structured around pre-dawn workouts and international conference calls, now revolved around school drop-offs and afternoon lab sessions in the garage with Julian and Gabriel. The science competition Julian had mentioned proved to be a pivotal moment. Elias sat in the audience, consciously positioned beside Imani rather than separate from her, as the twins presented their quantum entanglement model to a panel of judges who grew increasingly bewildered by the sophistication of the work. "They're not following," Julian whispered nervously to Gabriel as one judge leaned over to consult with another, brows furrowed in confusion. "Because they don't understand the underlying premise," Gabriel replied, adjusting his glasses. "We need to simplify the explanation." Elias watched with unexpected pride as the boys recalibrated their presentation on the fly, breaking down complex concepts into more digestible components without sacrificing accuracy. It was a skill most of his senior executives still struggled with, the ability to translate specialized knowledge for non-specialist audiences while maintaining intellectual integrity. When they were awarded first place, the beaming smiles they directed at both Imani and Elias felt like the first genuine acknowledgement of his place in their lives. The cardiology appointment with Julian was another milestone, though a more sobering one. Dr. Rosalie Chen, the pediatric cardiologist Elias had researched extensively before agreeing to her care, reviewed Julian's echocardiogram with professional detachment. "The ventricular wall thickening is moderate," she explained, pointing to the screen. "With proper medication and monitoring, there's no reason Julian can't live a completely normal life." "But contact sports are still inadvisable?" Imani asked, her hand resting protectively on Julian's shoulder. Dr. Chen nodded. "High-intensity competitive sports would put too much strain on the heart. But swimming, cycling, hiking, these are all excellent options." Julian's expression remained stoic, but Elias recognized the disappointment in his eyes. At 12, being told there were limitations to what your body could safely do carried a particular sting. "I played chess," Elias said quietly. "When I was your age. My father had the same condition, so I focused on activities that exercised the mind rather than the body." Julian looked up, curiosity replacing disappointment. "Were you good?" "Good enough to compete nationally, but not good enough to become a grandmaster," Elias admitted. "The pattern recognition was natural for me, but I lacked the patience for the deep strategic thinking required at the highest levels." "I've never played," Julian confessed. "It seemed old-fashioned." "It's the original pattern recognition game," Elias replied. "The foundation of computational thinking, in many ways. I could teach you, if you're interested." Something shifted in Julian's expression. A subtle opening, an invitation. "Yeah," he said with studied casualness. "That might be cool." Gabriel, never one to be left out of an intellectual challenge, immediately added, "I want to learn too." As they left the doctor's office, Imani fell into step beside Elias, letting the boys walk ahead. "That was well done," she said quietly, giving him an alternative to focus on. Elias shrugged slightly. "My father did the same for me." It was the one gift his absence gave me, understanding exactly what Julian is feeling right now. That evening, Elias arrived at Imani's house with 3 chess sets, a standard tournament set for practice, a handcrafted wooden set he'd found in a specialty shop in Newport, and a third, well-worn travel set that had clearly seen years of use. "This one was my father's," he explained to the twins as they examined the pieces. "He taught me on this board when I was about 9. I've carried it with me ever since. Even to Tokyo and Singapore." Gabriel asked, referencing business trips they knew about from news coverage of Winter's Innovations' global expansion. "Everywhere," Elias confirmed. "It was a way to feel connected to him after he died, I suppose. A physical link to the way he taught me to think." The admission of sentiment surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise the boys. In his corporate life, Elias had cultivated an image of cool rationality, decisions based on data rather than emotion. But here, with these children who carried his DNA, that careful separation between logic and feeling seemed both impossible and unnecessary. For the next few hours, he taught them the basics of chess, not just the rules and movements, but the underlying strategic principles, the way each piece contributed to the whole, the balance between offense and defense. Both boys absorbed the information quickly, though in characteristically different ways. Julian immediately looked for aggressive combinations, sacrificing pieces for position. Gabriel built careful defensive structures, preferring a slower, more methodical approach. It was nearly 11 when Imani finally insisted it was time for bed, despite protests that it was Friday and they could sleep in tomorrow. As they reluctantly packed away the pieces, Julian looked up at Elias with an expression of careful consideration. "You could come back tomorrow," he suggested. "To continue the lessons. If you're not busy with work stuff." The casual invitation contained a test. Would Elias prioritize them over the weekend work sessions that any quick internet search would have told the boys were his normal routine? "I'd like that," he said simply. "What time works for you?" If you've ever reconnected with someone from your past and found yourself building a new kind of relationship on the foundation of what came before, hit that like button. And if you're watching this and thinking about someone you've lost touch with, someone who might need you in their life, share this video as a reminder that it's never too late to reach out. The corporate fallout began 3 weeks into Elias's Newport residency, when the business press finally caught wind of his extended absence from Boston headquarters. The first headline was relatively benign: Winters Innovation CEO working remotely amid restructuring. The accompanying article speculated about potential strategic reasons for his relocation, citing unnamed sources suggesting he might be personally overseeing a new acquisition target in the Rhode Island area. Vanessa forwarded the article with a simple message: "Board wants statement on remote work arrangement." Multiple inquiries from major outlets. Elias considered his options. The story would eventually emerge, regardless of what he did now. The question was how to shape the narrative in a way that would protect Julian and Gabriel from unwanted attention while being transparent enough to satisfy investors. After consulting with Imani, who was understandably protective of the twins' privacy, he drafted a brief statement: "I am currently working from Newport, Rhode Island to be close to family, including my 2 sons who reside in the area. This personal priority does not affect my commitment to Winters Innovation's continued success. I ask for privacy for my family during this time." The statement, deliberately vague in its details, unleashed exactly the storm of speculation he had anticipated. Winters' heir revealed, CEO's secret family exposed, screamed one particularly dramatic headline. Innovation pioneer acknowledges children after 12-year absence, proclaimed another. The board called an emergency meeting, which Elias attended via secure video link from his Newport home office. The 7 faces on his screen ranged from openly concerned to barely concealed outrage. "This revelation has significant implications for shareholder confidence," Director Harriet Sanderson began without preamble. "The stock has already dropped 3 points since your statement was released." "A temporary fluctuation based on uncertainty," Elias replied calmly. "The fundamentals of the company remain unchanged." Lawrence Blackwood, the longest-serving board member and a friend of Elias's late father, leaned forward. "The question, Elias, is whether your priorities remain unchanged. This family situation. Is it a temporary distraction or a permanent shift in your focus?" The question cut to the heart of the matter. For 15 years, Elias had been synonymous with Winters Innovation, his vision, his drive, his uncompromising standards shaping every aspect of the company's identity. The board, the investors, the employees all believed in that singular focus. Now they were being asked to adjust to a fundamentally different reality. "My priorities have expanded, not shifted," he said carefully. "My commitment to Winters Innovation remains absolute. But yes, my sons will be a permanent part of my life going forward, which necessitates certain adjustments to my working arrangements." "Sons you never knew existed until a month ago," Sanderson pointed out. The skepticism in her voice was unmistakable. "How can we be confident this sudden paternal interest isn't equally temporary?" Elias felt a flash of anger at the implication, surprising himself with its intensity. Because unlike quarterly projections or market trends, Director Sanderson, my sons are not variables subject to fluctuation. They are permanent, non-negotiable commitments. The directness of his response silenced the board momentarily. Lawrence Blackwood's expression softened slightly. I knew your father well, Elias, he said after a pause. Gregory would have been pleased to know his legacy continues through grandsons. The mention of his father, unexpected in this context, caught Elias off guard. Gregory Winters had been a brilliant physicist whose work in quantum mechanics had laid the theoretical groundwork for much of Winters' innovation's later technological breakthroughs. He had also been a distant, demanding parent whose approval Elias had sought but rarely received. Yes, Elias agreed, his voice rougher than intended. I believe he would have been. The meeting concluded with a tentative acceptance of Elias's new arrangement, contingent on regular physical presence in Boston for critical meetings and a clear succession plan to address investor concerns about leadership continuity. As the video feed ended, Elias sat back in his chair, aware that he had just navigated a fundamental realignment of his professional identity, no longer just the visionary CEO, but also a father with divided priorities. His phone buzzed with a text from Imani, boys asking if you're still coming for dinner. Board meeting okay? The simple message, domestic and ordinary, struck him with its contrast to the high-stakes corporate drama he'd just navigated. On the one hand, billion-dollar market valuations and SH. R holder confidence. On the other, two 12-year-old boys wondering if he'd keep his dinner commitment. All fine, he replied. Be there in 20 minutes. Bringing chess boards. When he arrived at Imani's house, he found the twins in the garage lab, hunched over a circuit board with identical expressions of concentration. They looked up simultaneously as he entered, their initial response a quick brightening of their eyes, a slight straightening of posture revealing more than any words about their growing attachment to his presence. We thought maybe you had to go back to Boston, Julian said, aiming for a casual tone that didn't quite disguise his concern. The board would prefer that, Elias acknowledged, setting down the chess sets. But I explained my priorities have changed. Gabriel studied him carefully. Will this negatively impact your company's market position? We saw the stock price dropped after your statement. Of course they had been monitoring the business news, tracking the financial implications of their existence becoming public knowledge. Elias shouldn't have been surprised, yet he found himself continually underestimating the sophistication of their awareness. The market responds emotionally to uncertainty in the short term, he explained. Once investors understand that my presence here doesn't affect the company's fundamental value proposition, the price will stabilize. But your reputation as a hands-on CEO is part of that value proposition, Gabriel pointed out. The perception of your singular focus is a market differentiator for Winters' innovation. The astute analysis, precisely the point several board members had raised, made Elias smile despite the seriousness of the observation. You've been researching me, he said. Reading analyst reports and business profiles. Julian shrugged, not denying it. Know your subject before formulating hypotheses. Basic scientific method. And what hypothesis are you testing? Elias asked, genuinely curious about how they viewed the situation. The twins exchanged one of their telepathic glances before Julian answered. Whether your interest in us is sustainable given the competing demands on your attention and resources. The blunt assessment so characteristic of Julian's direct approach caught Elias off guard. But it was Gabriel who surprised him more with the follow-up question. Is your decision to prioritize us logical or emotional? He asked quietly. Because emotional decisions are subject to greater variability over time. The question revealed so much about their fears, about the careful walls they had built to protect themselves from potential disappointment. Elias considered his answer carefully, aware that these scientifically minded boys would see through any simplified reassurance. Both, he said finally. Logically, I recognize that you are my biological legacy, carrying forward not just my DNA but my cognitive architecture. The potential value of that connection is immeasurable. He paused, meeting their eyes directly. Emotionally, I feel drawn to you in a way I can't fully quantify or explain. Something in me recognizes something in you, beyond shared genetics or intellectual compatibility. Julian nodded slowly, processing this dual explanation. That aligns with our observations, he said. You display physiological markers of genuine emotional response when interacting with us: pupil dilation, increased vocal warmth, spontaneous mirroring of our gestures. Elias almost laughed at this clinical assessment of his growing paternal feelings. You've been cataloging my responses. It's important data, Gabriel said seriously. For our hypothesis testing. The conversation might have seemed bizarre to an outside observer, children analyzing their father's attachment patterns like scientists studying an unfamiliar species. But to Elias, it made perfect sense. This was how their minds worked, how his mind worked. They were approaching the uncertain territory of emotional connection with the tools they understood best: observation, analysis, hypothesis testing. What can I do to provide you with better data? He asked, accepting their framework rather than attempting to impose a more conventional emotional approach. The question seemed to surprise them both. Consistency is the key variable, Gabriel said after a moment of consideration. Predictable behavior patterns across a range of conditions and stressors. And transparency, Julian added. Access to your decision-making processes, especially when they involve us. Elias nodded, understanding exactly what they were asking for. Not just his presence, but his authenticity. Not just his attention, but his vulnerability. I can commit to both those parameters, he said. With one condition of my own. The twins waited expectantly. That you'll tell me directly if I'm failing to meet your needs. No polite evasions, no assuming I should intuitively understand. Just clear, direct feedback. They considered this, then nodded in synchronized agreement. That's efficient, Julian said approvingly. Minimizes data loss through indirect communication. Dinner that night was different, more relaxed, more open. As if the explicit acknowledgement of their mutual assessment had cleared the air, allowing for a more authentic connection. Even Imani seemed to notice the shift, her expression softening as she observed the increasingly natural interaction between Elias and their sons. Later, after the boys had gone up to bed, Imani joined Elias on the back porch where he sat contemplating the night sky. They're starting to trust you, she said, settling into the chair beside his. That's significant. I know. He turned to look at her profile, illuminated by the soft porch light. I never expected to feel this way, Imani. About them. About any of this. She smiled slightly. Parenthood has a way of rewiring your priorities. Even when it arrives 12 years late. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the distant sound of waves against the Newport shoreline. You're different, she observed eventually. Than you were 15 years ago. Less certain. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? He asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. Good, I think. Certainty was always your most attractive quality, until it became your most frustrating one. She turned to face him fully. The man I loved was brilliant and visionary. The man who left was rigid and unreachable. The words landed with the particular sting of truth recognized but never before acknowledged. What about the man sitting here now? He asked quietly. She studied him thoughtfully. Still evolving, I think. Still figuring out how to balance the visionary with the father, the brilliant theorist with the fallible human. It was perhaps the most honest conversation they had shared since his return to Newport. No blame, no recrimination, just clear-eyed assessment of who they had been and who they were becoming. The boys want to see where you work, Imani said, changing the subject slightly. They're curious about the Winters Innovation Headquarters. I'd be happy to take them, Elias replied. If you're comfortable with it. She nodded. I think it's important for them to understand that part of your life too. Not just the version of you that exists here with us. The suggestion marked another step forward in Imani's tacit acknowledgement that his relationship with the twins was becoming established enough to extend beyond the boundaries of Newport. That the separate worlds he had been navigating might begin to merge in carefully managed ways. "Thank you," he said simply. She rose to go inside, then paused at the door. "Elias? This arrangement you in their lives, it's good for them. I wanted you to know that." The quiet affirmation, offered without qualification or expectation, settled something in his chest that had been unsettled since the moment he first saw that photograph of two boys with his eyes. If you understand what it means to start over, to rebuild trust that was broken, to find your way back to what matters most, type second chances in the comments. And if this story is touching your heart, please subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories for more powerful reminders that it's never too late to rewrite your life's most important chapters. The first visit to Winter's innovation headquarters in Boston happened on a crisp Saturday morning in early autumn. Elias drove, with Julian and Gabriel in the back seat engaged in spirited debate about quantum computing architecture. Imani had declined to join them, citing work deadlines but perhaps also recognizing that this particular milestone belonged to Elias and his sons alone. As they approached the gleaming glass tower bearing the Winter's name, Gabriel fell silent, staring up at the building with an expression of quiet awe. "You designed this," he said. "The whole building." "Not the architecture," Elias corrected. "But the concept, yes. The integrated systems, the way the space functions." The lobby was deserted on a weekend, their footsteps echoing on polished marble as they crossed to the private elevator that would take them directly to the executive floor. The security guard nodded respectfully, trying and failing to hide his curious glance at the two boys flanking the CEO. "The rumors are true, then," Julian observed as the elevator doors closed. "About us?" Elias nodded. "There's been speculation in the press. Nothing confirmed beyond my statement that I have sons in Newport. But people are curious," Gabriel concluded. "Because we changed the narrative about you." "Yes," Elias acknowledged. "You change everything." The elevator opened directly into a vast open space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. One wall displayed a chronological installation of Winter's innovation breakthroughs from the early neural interface prototypes to the most recent quantum communication systems. Another featured a series of glass cases containing Elias's numerous awards and recognitions. "Do you actually work here?" Julian asked, taking in the pristine, almost sterile environment. "It doesn't look very functional." Elias smiled slightly. "This is for meetings and formal presentations. My actual workspace is through here." He led them through a set of pneumatic doors into a much more human-scaled environment. A private office with walls covered in digital displays, workstations arranged in a semicircle, and most surprisingly, a worn leather couch with a rumpled throw blanket suggesting frequent use. "I sleep here sometimes," Elias explained, seeing their interest in this incongruous domestic touch. "When working on complex problems that require extended focus." Julian walked straight to the central workstation, examining the custom-built interface with obvious appreciation. "This processing capability must be at least triple what we have in the garage." "More like 20 times, Elias corrected. "Would you like to try it?" For the next several hours, the three of them explored the technological resources of Winter's innovation Julian and Gabriel testing systems, asking penetrating questions, occasionally suggesting refinements that revealed their intuitive understanding of the underlying architectures. Elias found himself slipping easily into a teaching role, explaining design choices, demonstrating capabilities, answering their increasingly sophisticated queries. It was Gabriel who finally asked the question that had clearly been percolating between the twins all morning. "Why did you name it Winter's Innovation and not something more descriptive of the technology?" "It was my father's name," Elias replied. "A way of honoring his theoretical work that made much of this possible." "But he was never part of the company," Julian pointed out. "He died before you founded it." "True." Elias settled into his chair, suddenly reflective. He never saw what his theories helped create. Never knew if his work would have practical application or remain purely theoretical. The name was, my way of completing that circuit, I suppose. Connecting his abstract brilliance to tangible impact. Something in this explanation resonated with the boys, perhaps because they too lived in that space between theoretical understanding and practical application, their own brilliant minds still seeking the right channels for expression. As they prepared to leave, Gabriel lingered by one of the display cases, studying a particular award, the Hiroto Prize for Advancement in Neural Interface Technology, presented 5 years earlier. Mom has the article about this, he said quietly. It's in her drawer with the other things she kept about you. The revelation that Imani had maintained an archive of his professional achievements surprised Elias. Despite her apparent disinterest in his career, despite the hurt and disappointment of their separation, she had tracked his success, preserved evidence of his work. Not for herself, he realized, but for their sons. To help them understand the father they had never known. She wanted us to be proud of you, Julian said, as if reading his thoughts. Even when she was angry that you weren't there for us. The simple statement contained such emotional complexity. Imani's pain at his absence balanced against her determination that their sons would know their father's contributions to the world. Her personal disappointment set aside in service to their children's need for connection to their heritage. I would have been proud of you, Elias said suddenly, the words emerging before he had fully formed the thought. If I had known about you all these years. If I had watched you grow up. I would have been incredibly proud. The twins exchanged one of their communicative glances, processing this emotional declaration with their characteristic blend of scientific assessment and nascent vulnerability. The evidence suggests that's accurate, Gabriel said finally, his version of acceptance. On the drive back to Newport, both boys fell asleep, the excitement and mental stimulation of the day finally catching up with them. Elias glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Gabriel's head tipped against the window, Julian slumped against his brother's shoulder, both looking suddenly younger, more vulnerable in sleep. For the first time since learning of their existence, he allowed himself to fully imagine what might have been if he had known about Imani's pregnancy, if he had chosen differently 15 years ago. Would he have built Winter's innovation into the technological powerhouse it had become? Would the neural interface technology that was now saving lives in medical settings around the world exist in its current form? Or would his focus have been divided, his relentless drive tempered by the competing demands of fatherhood? There were no clear answers to these counterfactuals, no way to calculate the opportunity costs of paths not taken. But as he drove back toward Newport, toward the modest home where Imani had raised their sons with quiet determination and limited resources, he found himself less interested in what might have been and more focused on what still could be. The transition from occasional visitor to consistent presence in Julian and Gabriel's lives happened gradually over the following months. 3 dinners a week became 4, then 5. Chess lessons expanded into wider-ranging discussions of mathematics, physics, philosophy. Weekend visits to museums and scientific exhibitions became regular occurrences. Elias's rented house, initially just a convenient base for his extended Newport stay, began to transform into a second home for the twins. The spare bedroom became theirs, with 2 identical beds, desks, and computer setups mirroring their arrangement at Imani's. The dining room was converted into an expanded workspace where more ambitious projects could unfold, free from the space constraints of the garage lab. The corporate world adjusted to this new reality with varying degrees of acceptance. The board continued to express concerns about his divided attention, but these were increasingly muted as Winter's innovations' performance remained strong under the leadership model he had implemented. The business press moved on to newer scandals, the revelation of his secret sons becoming just another footnote in the biography of a technological visionary. More significant was the gradual thawing in his relationship with Imani. Their interactions, initially focused exclusively on co-parenting logistics, began to include moments of genuine connection, shared memories, inside jokes from their graduate school days, the particular shorthand that develops between people who have once known each other deeply. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep watching a documentary in Elias's living room, Imani accepted his offer of a glass of wine on the deck overlooking the water. "Do you remember this spot?" she asked, gesturing toward a distant point along the shoreline barely visible in the moonlight. That little cove where we used to study during finals week. The boathouse, Elias nodded, the memory surfacing with unexpected clarity. You were working on your thesis project that sustainable housing design for coastal communities. She looked surprised that he remembered. You said it would never get approved by conservative planning boards. That I was being too idealistic. I was wrong, he admitted. Your designs are being implemented in half a dozen coastal cities now. I've been following your work. It was her turn to look surprised. You have? Of course. Your innovations in climate-adaptive architecture are remarkable. He hesitated, then added, I always knew you were brilliant, Imani. I just didn't understand that brilliant minds can follow different paths. She studied him in the moonlight, perhaps seeing shadows of the young man she had once loved in the successful but solitary figure he had become. You were so certain about everything back then, she said finally. So convinced there was only one right way forward your way. I still struggle with that, he acknowledged. But the boys are teaching me to consider alternative perspectives. She smiled slightly. They do that. Challenge assumptions. Question everything. Like someone else I used to know. The comparison linking him to his sons in temperament as well as genetics warmed something in him that had been cold for too long. I've been thinking about relocating permanently, he said after a comfortable silence. Not just the rental. Buying a real home here in Newport. Imani nodded, unsurprised. The boys would like that. They've been speculating about whether you'll stay. What about you? He asked, the question containing layers of meaning neither of them was quite ready to fully explore. Would you like that? She considered this, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded. I think. I would. For their sake, primarily. But also because. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because you're different now. In ways that matter. It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness, or an invitation to rebuild what they had once shared. But it was an acknowledgement of change, of growth, of possibility. For Elias, who had spent 15 years measuring success in market share and technological breakthroughs, this simple human connection felt like a different kind of achievement entirely. 6 months after Julian and Gabriel had entered his life, Elias stood in the doorway of his newly renovated home office in the permanent residence he had purchased in Newport. The room had been designed specifically to accommodate 3 with custom desks arranged in a triangle formation that allowed for independent work while maintaining sight lines for collaboration. The boys, now approaching their 13th birthday, were adjusting the positioning of their workstations, arguing good-naturedly about optimal configurations for their joint projects. The network configuration is complete, GA. Briel reported, not looking up from his monitor. Secured against external access but with the integration points you specified. And I've transferred our simulation environment, Julian added. It's running at 343% previous capacity with the new hardware. Excellent, Elias replied, setting down the tray of drinks he'd brought. But it's almost 9. Your mother will be calling soon for your nightly check-in. The custody arrangement they developed was still evolving: weekdays with Imani in the home they'd always known, weekends, and 2 evenings a week at Elias's new house. The corporate headquarters in Boston was now a 2-hour drive rather than a transcontinental flight, allowing Elias to balance his company responsibilities with his newly discovered paternal ones. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been arguments with the board about his reduced availability, tense conversations with Imani about educational philosophies, awkward moments with the twins when his inexperience as a father collided with their established routines. There had been public speculation about his motives, private doubts about his commitment, and the constant negotiation of boundaries between 4 people learning to form a family from fractured beginnings. But there had also been breakthroughs. The moment Gabriel finally called him Dad instead of Elias, casually, while explaining a circuit design. The Saturday morning Julian fell asleep against his shoulder during an early documentary viewing. The evening Imani agreed to join them for dinner and stayed talking until past midnight, reminiscing about their college days with a warmth he'd thought was permanently lost. And perhaps most significantly, the day Elias realized he was happier in this complicated, messy family arrangement than he had been at the peak of his corporate success. On his desk now sat 3 photographs, one of the twins at their recent science competition, first place, naturally. One of Imani at the architectural award ceremony he'd attended as her guest last month, and one faded image from 15 years ago, Elias and Imani on the Newport beach, young and unaware of how their paths would diverge and reconnect. The video call tone sounded from Julian's computer. Both boys immediately abandoned their projects to answer, their faces lighting with the simple joy of seeing their mother. "Hi, Mom." Julian called, adjusting the camera so she could see both of them. "How's the conference?" Gabriel added, pushing his glasses up his nose. Imani's face appeared on screen, hotel room visible behind her. "Fascinating. I'm presenting my sustainable community design tomorrow." Her eyes shifted to include Elias in her view. "Are they behaving for you?" "Perfectly," Elias assured her, moving to stand behind the boys where she could see him. "Though I may need help deciphering the homework schedule tomorrow." "It's color-coded in the shared calendar," all 3 of them said simultaneously, then laughed at the coincidence. As Julian and Gabriel updated Imani on their day, Elias observed the interaction with quiet wonder. This improvised family, rebuilt from silence and absence, now functioned with its own rhythm. Imperfect but intentional. Fragile but determined. "We've been working on the neural interface simulation," Julian was explaining excitedly. "Dad thinks our pattern recognition algorithm could have applications for his medical division." The casual use of "Dad," still new enough to catch Elias by surprise each time, was accompanied by a flash of pride in Julian's expression, as if the word itself connected him to the legacy of innovation they now shared. The boys' project had indeed shown remarkable potential, combining Gabriel's theoretical insights with Julian's practical coding abilities to create a neural pattern detection system more sensitive than anything Winter's Innovations Research Division had developed. Elias had already begun the process of patenting the core algorithm in their names, his first tangible acknowledgement of their intellectual heritage. Later, after the boys were asleep in their newly decorated rooms, Julian's walls covered with aerospace engineering posters, Gabriel's with maps of theoretical quantum states, Elias sat on his deck overlooking the same ocean where he'd once promised Imani forever. His phone buzzed with a message from her. "They asleep?" "Just now." "Gabriel was reading that physics journal you sent." Julian was sketching drone modifications. A pause, then, "You're doing well with them, you know." The simple affirmation settled something in his chest. "I'm trying. Learning as I go. That's all any of us do. Even with a 15-year head start." He smiled at the screen, picturing her in her hotel room, perhaps sitting by a window similar to his, the same stars visible from different vantage points. "What happens when you get back?" He typed, then deleted, then typed again before finally sending. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "We continue. One day at a time." Not a declaration of reconciliation or forgiveness, but not a rejection either. An acknowledgement of possibility, of paths gradually converging after years of parallel existence. "One day at a time," he agreed, looking out at the horizon where sea met sky in a liminal space of transition. The empire he'd built still stood, the innovations he'd championed still mattered. But sitting there, holding the possibility of his reconfigured family in his hands, Elias Winters finally understood what success actually meant. Not acquisition targets or market capitalization, but this, the chance to know the sons who carried his legacy in their DNA, and perhaps, someday, to rebuild what he'd once discarded with the woman who had never stopped shaping his heart. The silence of 15 years had been broken. Now, they would discover what echoes remained, and what new harmonies they might create together. 3 months later, Imani stood in the doorway of the shared office, watching the synchronized movement of 3 dark heads bent over a complex circuit board. The resemblance between father and sons had grown more pronounced as the twins approached 13, or perhaps it was simply more visible now that they shared not just genetics but mannerisms, thought patterns, even certain phrases that had migrated from Elias's vocabulary into theirs. Julian noticed her first, looking up with an expression of excited accomplishment. "Mom! We got it working. The distributed neural net is processing at 97% efficiency." Gabriel, always more attuned to emotional undercurrents, studied her more carefully. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she assured them, moving into the room. "But I need to discuss something with the three of you." Elias straightened, instantly alert to the seriousness in her tone. "Something about the house?" he asked, referring to the ongoing negotiations with her landlord about renewing the lease. "No, something about us. All of us." She took a breath, gathering her thoughts. "The Callahan Center in Boston has offered me a position heading their Climate Resilience Architecture division. It would be a significant professional opportunity." "That's wonderful," Elias said immediately, genuine pleasure in his voice. "They're doing groundbreaking work in sustainable urban development." The twins remained silent, processing the implications with their characteristic analytical focus. "Boston is approximately 74.6 miles from Newport," Gabriel said finally. "A commute of that distance would be impractical on a daily basis." "Which means you'd have to move," Julian concluded. "And we'd have to choose where to live primarily. With you or with Dad." The stark assessment cut through any attempt at gentle introduction. Imani nodded, acknowledging the accuracy of their conclusion. "Yes. Or we could consider other arrangements." She looked at Elias, including him explicitly in the decision. "Such as all of us relocating to the Boston area." The suggestion that they might move together, as a unit hung in the air between them. Not just a co-parenting arrangement between separate households, but something more integrated, more intentional. Elias processed this possibility, his mind immediately running through practical considerations. Winter's innovation headquarters was in Boston, eliminating his current commute. The educational resources for the twins would be exceptional. The logistical advantages were obvious. But the deeper implications of what it would mean for his evolving relationship with Imani, for their tentative reconstruction of what had once been broken, those were more complex, more loaded with both potential and risk. "I think we should consider it," he said finally, his voice careful. "If it's the right professional move for you, Imani, and if the boys are comfortable with the idea." Julian and Gabriel exchanged one of their telepathic glances, a silent assessment passing between them. The probability of optimal outcomes would increase with geographical proximity of both parental units, Gabriel observed, his formal phrasing failing to disguise the emotional weight behind the analysis. "And Dad already has connections to educational and research institutions in Boston that would provide expanded opportunities for our development," Julian added. Imani smiled slightly at their logical approach to what was fundamentally an emotional question. "But what do you want?" she asked gently. "Not what makes sense on paper, but how do you feel about all of us moving to Boston?" The twins looked momentarily stymied by this direct appeal to feelings rather than analysis. It was Julian who finally answered, with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "I like when we're all together," he admitted. "Like when we have dinner at Dad's house and you stay late talking, or when we went to the science museum and people thought we were." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "A normal family," Gabriel finished for him. "United rather than divided by custody schedules and geographical separation." The simple articulation of their desire to be a cohesive unit rather than carefully managed fragments struck Elias with unexpected force. In their scientifically rigorous way, his sons were asking for exactly what he had been afraid to voice himself, the chance to rebuild not just their individual relationships with him, but the family that might have been. "We would need to proceed carefully," he said, meeting Imani's gaze directly. "Test the hypothesis under controlled conditions before making permanent changes." She smiled, recognizing his adoption of the twins' analytical framework. "Are you suggesting an experiment, Dr. Winters?" "A pilot program," he replied, matching her lighter tone. Perhaps a month-long trial in Boston, all four of us, to evaluate the viability of the arrangement before making permanent commitments. Julian nodded approvingly. That's methodologically sound. We could establish clear metrics for success and failure conditions. And collect both quantitative and qualitative data, Gabriel added, clearly warming to the idea. Subjective experience reports alongside objective outcome measurements. Imani's expression softened as she watched the three of them automatically forming a collaborative unit, approaching this potential life change with the same rigorous methodology they applied to their technical projects. All right then, she agreed. A 1-month pilot program, beginning after I accept the position, if that's what I decide to do. We'll all relocate temporarily to Boston and see what happens. The scientific framing, the careful language of experimentation and evaluation allowed all of them to approach this emotionally charged possibility with a measure of protective distance. But beneath the analytical veneer, Elias recognized the profound significance of what they were considering. Not just a logistical reconfiguration, but a genuine attempt to heal the fracture that had defined their lives for 15 years. 3 weeks later, they stood together in the spacious penthouse apartment Elias had secured for their Boston experiment, a neutral territory belonging to none of them individually, selected specifically for this trial period of shared living. The twins had already claimed their room, identical beds positioned on opposite walls, desks facing each other in the center, creating a mirror image configuration that satisfied their need for both independence and proximity. Imani had settled into the guest suite at the opposite end of the apartment from Elias's room, a deliberate separation that acknowledged the tentative nature of their personal reconnection. This feels weird, Julian announced as they gathered in the living room that first evening. Artificial. Like a simulation, Gabriel agreed. Of what might have been. The observation hung in the air, a recognition of the counterfactual nature of their arrangement, this placeholder for the family that had never had the chance to form naturally. Maybe that's okay, Imani suggested after a moment. Maybe we need a simulation before we can build something real. Elias nodded, understanding her meaning. Their shared history, the abandonment, the absence, the years of separate development couldn't simply be erased. This artificial arrangement was perhaps the necessary bridge between their fractured past and whatever integrated future they might create together. A controlled environment for testing new parameters, he said, offering the twins the framework that would make sense to them. Not trying to recreate what might have been, but designing what could be. The distinction seemed to satisfy them, shifting their perception from artificial recreation to intentional creation. Not a simulation of the past, but a prototype for the future. That first month in Boston unfolded as a carefully calibrated experiment in family formation. There were adjustments, of course, negotiations about shared spaces, about meal planning, about the balance between independence and togetherness. Julian and Gabriel thrived in the expanded educational opportunities of the city, diving into research collaborations at both MIT and Winter's Innovations Advanced Development Lab. Imani excelled in her new position at the Callahan Center, her sustainable architecture designs drawing attention from urban planners around the world. And Elias, perhaps most surprisingly to himself, discovered a capacity for balance he had never believed possible. The integration of his professional identity with his emerging role as a father and co-parent didn't diminish his effectiveness at Winter's Innovation. If anything, it enhanced it, bringing a new perspective to his leadership, a more nuanced understanding of the human impact of technological advancement. When the month ended, the four of them gathered again in the living room to evaluate the results of their experiment. Julian and Gabriel presented a detailed analysis, complete with charts tracking everything from productivity metrics to subjective happiness indicators. The data suggests clear advantages to continued cohabitation, Gabriel concluded, pushing his glasses up his nose in a gesture that had become so familiar to Elias. Statistical significance at the p=.01 level, Julian added proudly. Elias and Imani exchanged amused glances at their son's thoroughly scientific approach to what was, at its core, an emotional decision. And what about the non-quantifiable aspects? Imani asked gently. How do you feel about our arrangement? The twins looked momentarily confounded by this direct appeal to emotion rather than data. I feel stable, Gabriel said finally, the admission clearly difficult for him. Like the variables are controlled. I feel like we make sense together, Julian added, his usual confidence muted by the vulnerability of the statement. Like a complete system rather than separated components. Elias understood exactly what they meant. The four of them had developed a synchronicity over the past month, a natural rhythm that made their individual strengths complement rather than compete with each other. Imani's intuitive creativity balanced his analytical precision. Julian's bold hypotheses were tempered by Gabriel's methodical testing. Together, they formed something greater than the sum of their parts. I think we should continue the arrangement, he said, looking to Imani for her reaction. Make it permanent, if everyone agrees. She met his gaze steadily, searching for something in his expression. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. I think we should too. Not because it's logical or efficient or statistically significant, but because it feels right. Because we're better together than apart. The simplicity of this truth acknowledged without qualification or reservation settled over them like a mantle of belonging. They were better together. Not perfect, not without complications, but fundamentally stronger as a unit than as fragments. The boys smiled, identical expressions of cautious happiness that reminded Elias so strongly of his own rare moments of contentment that he had to look away briefly to compose himself. Does this mean you're getting back together? Julian asked, direct as always. Romantically? The question caught both Elias and Imani off guard. We're focusing on being effective co-parents, Imani said carefully. Building a stable family environment for both of you. But the statistical probability of romantic reconciliation increases by approximately 68% under conditions of prolonged proximity and positive interaction, Gabriel observed, clearly having calculated this particular data point with great interest. Elias found himself fighting a smile at their transparent attempt to engineer a complete family reconstruction. Are you trying to manipulate variables to achieve your preferred outcome? Julian shrugged, unapologetic. Intelligent agents naturally attempt to optimize their environment for maximum benefit. And our relationship status affects your benefit matrix? Imani asked, her tone gently teasing. Obviously, both boys said in unison. The conversation shifted to more practical matters then, the logistics of making their temporary arrangement permanent, the decisions about schooling and work schedules and household management. But the question lingered in the air between Elias and Imani, acknowledged but not yet answered. Later that night, after the twins had gone to bed, they sat together on the balcony overlooking the Boston skyline, the lights of the city reflecting in the harbor below. They're not subtle, Imani observed, amusement in her voice. Subtlety has never been a Winters family trait, Elias agreed. My father was equally direct about what he wanted. She turned to look at him more fully. And what do you want, Elias? Not what makes logical sense or what benefits the boys, but what do you actually want for yourself? The question, so similar to the one she had asked the twins about their feelings, cut through his carefully maintained analytical distance. What did he want, beyond the practical advantages of their arrangement, beyond the clear benefits to Julian and Gabriel? I want this, he said finally, gesturing to encompass the home they had created, the family they were rebuilding. But not just for the boys. For me. For us. He met her eyes directly. I want another chance, Imani. Not to recreate what we were 15 years ago, but to discover what we might become now. She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words with the careful thoughtfulness that had always been her way. When she finally spoke, her voice held none of the hesitation he had feared. I think I want that too, she said simply. One day at a time. It wasn't a dramatic declaration, no sweeping promises or passionate avowals. Just a quiet acknowledgement of possibility, of willingness to explore the uncharted territory between their past and their potential future. Elias reached across the space between them, offering his hand palm up on the table. After a moment, Imani placed her hand in his, their fingers interlacing with the familiarity of long practice and the tentative care of new beginning. 1 year later, on a brilliant autumn day much like the one when Imani had first appeared at his 40th birthday celebration, Elias stood on the deck of their Boston home watching his sons demonstrate their latest project to a small gathering of family and friends. Now 13, the twins had grown taller, their voices occasionally cracking with the first signs of adolescence, but their minds remained as remarkable as ever, perhaps even more so for the nurturing environment they now inhabited. The neural interface prototype they had developed, with guidance from both Elias and the research team at Winter's Innovation, represented a genuine breakthrough in how machine learning systems could interpret human intention. The commercial applications were significant, but more meaningful to Elias was the pride evident in their faces as they explained their work not just to him, but to the assembled group that included Imani's parents, his own aunt and uncle, and key members of both their professional teams. "This is only the initial configuration," Julian was explaining, his confidence tempered by the new humility he had developed over the past year. "We're still optimizing the pattern recognition algorithms. But the preliminary results indicate a 62% improvement over current industry standards," Gabriel added, pushing up the new glasses that framed his increasingly mature features. Imani appeared beside Elias, slipping her hand into his with the easy affection that had developed between them. "They're incredible," she said quietly. "And so much like you." He smiled, watching as the boys fielded technical questions with the synchronized precision that had become their trademark. "They're better than me," he replied. "They have your vision too, your ability to see beyond the immediate problem to the human impact." She leaned against him slightly, a gesture of both affection and agreement. "They're the best of both of us, I think. What might have been created 15 years ago, just delivered on a delayed timeline." The observation contained no recrimination, no lingering bitterness about the years of separation. They had moved beyond blame into something more nuanced and acceptance that their path, however circuitous, had led them precisely where they needed to be. As the demonstration concluded and their guests moved inside for dinner, Elias held Imani back for a moment on the deck, suddenly needing to articulate something that had been building in him for months. "Thank you," he said simply. "For finding me that night. For breaking through the walls I built. For giving me the chance to know them, to know you again." She studied him with the clear-eyed perception that had always seen through his carefully constructed facades. "You found your way back, Elias. To them, to yourself. I just opened the door." It was true, in its way. The man he had been 15 years ago, brilliant but rigid, visionary but isolated, had been lost long before Imani appeared at his birthday gala. Lost to ambition, to the particular loneliness of success without connection, to the hollow achievement of building an empire with no one to share it. In finding his sons, in rebuilding his relationship with Imani, he had also rediscovered something essential in himself, not just the capacity for love and vulnerability, but the profound joy of genuine connection. The particular satisfaction that came not from market dominance or technological breakthroughs, but from watching his sons master a difficult concept, from sharing quiet evenings with Imani where no words were needed, from being part of something larger than his individual achievements. Inside, Julian called for them to join the group, his voice carrying the easy authority of a child secure in his place within a loving family. Elias and Imani turned together, moving toward the warmth and light of the home they had created from fragments of what was and visions of what could be. The empire he'd built still stood, the innovations he'd championed still mattered. But as he entered the dining room filled with the people who now constituted his world, Elias Winters finally understood what success actually meant. Not acquisition targets or market capitalization, but this. The chance to know the sons who carried his legacy in their DNA, and the opportunity to rebuild what he'd once discarded with the woman who had never stopped shaping his heart. The silence of 15 years had been broken. In its place, a new harmony had emerged, complex, occasionally discordant, but ultimately more beautiful than anything he could have composed alone. If this story has touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who might be struggling to reconnect with family or who needs a reminder that it's never too late for a second chance. And subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories for more powerful reminders that true success isn't measured in dollars or achievements, but in the depth of our connections to the people who matter most. Remember, sometimes what we think we've lost was never really gone, just waiting for us to find our way back to it. One day at a time.